meeting him and then bring forward or something.
Okay, meeting him for the first time.
Okay.
Sure.
Whenever you're ready.
To me?
Whenever you're ready.
Okay. Good. We're all set.
I was stationed in Munich, Germany. I was an athlete with the 24th Division, and they needed someone to go into the Rome Olympics in 1960. And we had Skeeter McClure, and Eddie Crooks on the boxing team. So I went in there to sign pay vouchers. I played 3 sports in the service: football, baseball, and basketball. So they needed someone who wasn't a soldier, but who was an athlete, who knew their way around the arenas and around athletes. So I went in and I first met at that time, it was Cassius Clay. And I remember walking down the streets with him and McClure and Eddie Crooks was there. And some little Italian guy came up and he asked him, he said, "Excuse me, do you have any money?" And Cassius Clay looked at him and he said, "What do you need it for?" He said, "I need it to eat." And Cassius Clay had $8 in his pocket. He was a young kid. And he pulled out the $8 and he said, "Here's 5. I said, "Cassius, you just had $8 and you gave him 5. He said, "God tested me. So if I do wrong, God could punish me. And if he did wrong, God punishes him." So I knew he was an individual with a lot of depth. I didn't spend that much time with him because I was busy with the Army personnel in the '60 Olympics.
Did you see him fight at the Olympics? Did
Yeah.
you ever see him in the ring?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we watched him train. And in the boxing world at that time, in the amateur, all-Army, inter-service boxing, Olympic trials, they all spoke about Cassius Clay from Louisville, Kentucky. How fast he was, how quick he was. And he fought an Army fighter by the name of Henderson. And he was the killer, and Cassius Clay handled him with ease. And everybody said, "Whoa, this guy is really something."
There is, how did you get to know him? How did you strike up a relationship
Well,
with him?
we became, so-called, not friends, but associates at that time. And then when I came out, I went with the Philadelphia Eagles, and he went into boxing. And then we went to the Doug Jones fight, myself and a guy by the name of Don Bragg, who was on the Olympic pole vaulting team. He won the gold medal. And when he fought Doug Jones in New York, we went to that fight. And after the fight, we went to a little party at Will Chamberlain's place, Mr. Smalls. And he was always a nice guy, and he cared for people around him. He cared for the doorman. He cared for the humble guy. He wasn't interested in the big money guy or the guy who owned the building. He was more interested in the doorman and the cook. And, he had a lot of depth to him. And this kind of impressed me. So then when he was in exile and he wasn't fighting, I hooked him up with a gentleman by the name of Richard Fulton. And he did all the college lecturing for him. And what was remarkable, I would go sometime. I was working at that time, MGM in New York City. And I would go on the college lecturing tour to a couple of colleges with him, and he would get up, he would speak, who's the greatest and who's the real champion. And he conducted himself well. And I remember right after the affair, they would give him his $2,000 cash, and we would head right to Western Union, and he'd send some money to his mom and dad, and then take the rest home to his wife at that time, Belinda, and she had a little girl there, May. And many times I asked him, "What was the thrill of your life?" And he didn't say when he won the gold medal, when he won the champion. He said when his daughter Miriam was born, that was the biggest thrill of his life. That was the most exciting time.
I want to move you up to the college tour and the exile. I want to ask you a little bit about.
Thank you, sir.
Because you know him and you sort of have a sense of his childhood, a bit about how he was raised. He was not from a very poor South, but he came from strong parents. What can you tell me about his childhood?
Well, his dad worked. His dad was a sign painter. His dad was an artist. He did a lot of great things in Louisville. And the father believed at that time that the mother should stay home with the children and raise the children. They weren't wealthy people, but they always had enough to eat. And he made sure the father worked hard and always made sure the children were dressed well. He and his brother at that time was Rudy, and then he switched over to Rahman when he accepted Islam faith. But the father was a strong man and a good man. I had a lot of respect for the father and the mother. When I used to look at him when he had that, "I'm going to whip him, I'm going to do," that was his dad. And then he had that soft and nice side about it. That was his mom. When he thanked the waitress and that, oh, thank you very much. And that was his mom. He had his mom and dad in him, but he was always a caring guy. He always had time for the poor, the depressed, the deprived. I used to say he was the champion of kindness. He cared for people.
Where do you think he came, he had this sort of deep caring for his race as well, and I'm wondering where that sense of color and
Well,
pride
he
came
told
from.
me a story one time. He said that he was raised Southern Baptist, and he went into a church. He used to go to his church on Sunday, and they all sang the same songs, and he looked up at the wall, and all the apostles were white, all the disciples were white, Jesus was white, there were no blacks. So he questioned, well, they must have been in the kitchen cooking. And then he came out of that church, and he went down to a white church and heard them same songs being sung. And he listened for a while, and out comes the minister, and he's standing there. He was the only black kid standing, the only black person. And the minister said, come on, nigger boy, you got to get out of here. So he knew something was wrong. So then he heard the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. We don't have our own name. We don't have our own country. We have to rely on the white man, and we got to do for ourselves, clean up our neighborhood. And he liked what he heard. And I always say this, that if he didn't follow the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, his teachings, it gave him credibility. It gave him the 3 Ds, dedication, determination, and discipline. Who knows what would have happened to him? But because of that, and I remember when he was fighting for his first championship fight with Sonny Liston, and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad told him, how could you lose? Allah is on your side. So I look back and I see, I was just a young kid. I used to see Notre Dame football team go to communion, and they pray to God and all. And then people say, well, he's a Muslim. He's entitled. Our country was based on free religion. He's entitled to believe in what he wants to believe in. And he was sincere about his religion. And I respect him, man. If you're going to do something, do it right. Whether it's religion, boxing, or shoe shine, no matter what you want to be in right, try to be your best. And that's what he did. If he would have concentrated on scholastic instead of athletic, he could have been a great doctor, a lawyer, scientist, but he started following boxing. He told me when he was in high school, he used to sit there and draw Olympic jackets, and someday I'm going to go to the Olympics. So he had a goal, and he followed his goal, and he was dedicated to his goal.
He seemed a boxer right out of the womb in some ways. I mean, yep. Since his red bike was stolen and he went to the gym, boxing was in his makeup, in his blood.
Well, he told me one time, he said that if there's a lot of ants on the ground, God will look down and you'll see one ant leading the pack, and God kind of looks out for him a little bit. And that's the way he felt.
I want to just get your impressions of Clay Liston, because, that was and what you know about it and understand about it. It was an immense fight. Liston so favored. A young Cassius Clay coming into this fight with all kinds of bravado. He goes nuts in the pre-fight, sort of press conference. He always had that voice and bravado, and I'm just wondering, Clay Liston, when you think about that fight, what comes to mind to you?
Well, going back to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, when he told him, how could Sonny Liston beat you? Allah's on your side. And he was a young kid, and he realized everything he did in life, he's always helped people. He's never hurt anybody. So God is going to help him. He had no fear. He had no fear. And always remember something about life and athletes. I learned this from Vince Lombardi. To be a great athlete, you must have in this order: brains, speed, and guts, in that order, to be great. Now, you could have guts third and brains second and speed, but to be great, you must have brains first, speed second, and guts third. And he had that in all that order.
It's interesting, there's a lot of talk about the Muslims and how much their role in the relationship between Ali and the Black Muslim movement, and whether or not one was using other or one was a part of other. I'm wondering if you believe the Black Muslims may have had an agenda hitching their ride to a young.
No, they didn't. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad could care little about his boxing. He liked him as a person. And I do know this, when he was in exile and needed money, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad came and helped him financially. and his son Herbert, who was his manager. You have to remember one thing: at that era, football players were making 30,000, 40,000, maybe 50,000, including basketball stars and baseball stars. So when Herbert started to negotiate their contract, then all the athletes started to get paid big money. They said, well, look at Cassius Clay. He's only going to fight 3 rounds. And look what he's getting. You know, he's getting 400,000, $500,000. So then they start paying the athletes more. One time the owners were making all the money with the closed circuit, not the closed circuit, but the television rights and the gates and the merchandising. So he opened the gates for all the other athletes. I believe that in my heart because of Herbert Muhammad.
64, in 1964, the Beals were on Ed Sullivan. You know, the Berkeley free speech movement was breaking out. It was a very complicated time. And how was Ali's life sort of a reflection of the mood in America? How does he fit into that whole fabric of America at that time?
Well, you got to remember at that time everybody was protesting and out, stop the war, we don't want to go, hell no, we're not going to go. You never seen Ali do any of that stuff. He never burned the draft boards. He never threw blood on counters and the draft boards. And still here they had the, what was it, the Magnificent Seven or whatever they were called at that time. They took Ali's passport, but they never took their passport. And Ali never did any of that thing. He just believed, that the Vietnam War was an unjust and unholy war. And years later, he was proven right. I had a young friend of mine, Bob Carmody, who was on the Olympic team with Joe Frazier. He won the bronze medal in the Olympics. And he was killed in the service. He was a military man. He was a sergeant, never been in the service. And I went to his funeral, myself and Joe Frazier, and I thought the people would tell me, oh, you know, Muhammad Ali, you know, and they told me there should be more like him. There should be more people like him and stop this war. If you trace it back now, you'll see that in Vietnam, the rich people went into Paris to live, and our guys went over and fought for it. And then later, the people with our government said we had no right to be there.
Ali's decision not to go to Vietnam obviously set off shockwaves in the boxing world. But it also connected him to other walks of life. Can you explain?
Okay, you said it set off shockwaves in the boxing world. How about the young kids in America? It was time to get drafted. They went up to Canada. I had a friend of mine come out of college. It's get time to draft, so he took a job. He was a lawyer. He took a job teaching where he could get a deferment. I had another friend of mine came out of MIT. He was going to get drafted, but they sent him over to London to work with the computer company with Gulf. So who was the draft dodger, Muhammad Ali or the other people? I mean, there were people who went up to Canada, they came back now and they ran for political offices and won, but you never hear about that. At that time, there was the reserve. I remember I was with the Philadelphia Eagles at the time. You couldn't get into the reserve. But we had football players come into town, and we got them in the reserve so they wouldn't be drafted. He stuck by his convictions. He gave up the 3 most valuable years of his life, and he said he didn't care. Take my tail and put it to jail. I believe that this is an unjust, unholy war. No one came and bombed my country. Nobody called me a nigger. That was his statement. And he, you know, why should he be mad at those people?
Does he appeal now because of that decision? Does he appeal now to a different group of Americans?
Anyone who makes a stand in life, you know, people thought Columbus was crazy. He thought the world was flat or found out it wasn't. Anyone who takes a stand and follows their belief, you can't fool the public. You know, you see politicians today, they're saying one thing, doing another, then years later you find out all about it. You can't fool the public. He never tried to fool the public. When you tell a lie, when you tell the truth, you don't have to remember. When you tell a lie, you have to remember it. So he told the truth. He didn't have nothing to regret. And if he had his life to live over, I said to him one time, if you had your life to live over, would you still make the same decisions? And he thought for a minute. He said, yeah, then it wouldn't be me. I would do the same thing because that's what made me. That's why I believed in. And I'm not going to listen. People came to us and they said, here's some tax shelters you could get into, and here's this and that with all your money. He said, no, give to Caesar what's Caesar's and to God what's God. I'm not going to go up before a judge and say the judge will say, and his client will, the lawyer will say, my client is a good guy, he's never been in trouble, and the judge is going to say, yes, but he broke the law, he has to go to jail. And the lawyer goes on and practice. So he said he didn't want any tax shelters, just pay whatever had to be paid.
You know, it's interesting when you read about Ali, they strip him of his title, and clearly there are lots of people that agree he may have lost the best years of his career, and we don't know how good he would have become, but in that time he also gained, he sort of surpassed boxing. He gained the fan base of the country, people, white people. I mean, his fan base was generally in the early 60s was a black fan base. But when he stood up against the war and began traveling around the country speaking to colleges, that fan base exploded in some ways. And what I'm wondering is, you were very connected to this speaking tour and these years that he had getting around the country. How did that come about? How did you come up with that? Because I think it's a really important.
Well, at that time, a lot of people were making big money doing college lecturing, and I thought, you know, this is a young guy who is articulate, even though he had trouble reading and writing, and he would study a lot and get things down. And I believe this would be good. And I met this fellow in New York who was doing the college lecture, and he said, let me put out a couple feelers. And he represented a lot of the people. And the first feeler, he got a lot of requests back. He said, wow, I didn't think this guy was that hot. People want to find out, what is he about? What is he like?
And it was, in some ways, do you think it was good for him philosophically? I mean, for him to get his head together a little
Yeah,
bit?
his head wasn't, his head was never off his shoulders. His head was always together. He had a goal, he had a destination, he had a determination. His head was always on his shoulders.
What was he talking about out there among white crowds and Harvard graduates and those? What was his message generally?
His message was at that time about the Vietnam War and who's the real champion. You know, he wasn't out saying we got to burn buildings, we got to do this and that. He was about education. He wanted freedom, justice, and equality for the black man. Now, is he wrong by wanting that? You know, a politician today, if he's running, and he says, I want freedom, justice, and equality for the black man, he may be elected somewhere. But he was long before his time. You know, he loved the black people. He was dedicated to the black people. And he believes in his heart that God picked him out to be a spokesman with the guidance of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad.
Do you think, in your heart of hearts at that time, do you think he was going to get back into boxing? Did you have a feeling that he would make it somehow back to the
I
sport?
feel, we discussed that many times at that time, that he would be back. But he said if it didn't happen, it didn't happen. He's not going to lay on their doorstep and beg them to come back. Yeah, he was convinced. He's not going to beg them, you know. People would come to him and say, we can get you a license here, and we can get you a license there. I want you to go with you. He said, no, I'm not going to go begging. You go talk to them and see what happens. I went down, I met with Governor John Bill Williams in Mississippi, and they gave us a boxing license. And then I had an individual with me who announced it, which we wanted to do it in New York with the governor at the same time, but this guy announced it on his own, tried to be a big shot, and then the governor said, it's only a permit. He took it back. So it was just a matter of time. And then Senator Johnson in Louisville, they put on the fight there with Quarry. And then New York, who banned him, they said, look at all the money we're missing. You know, a fight in New York City, you don't want all the people come in there, all the tourists, all the boxing, you know. And it was just a matter of time. In New York, Madison Square Garden was the mecca of boxing.
Do you think he expanded his fan base to the to a great extent with those years off and the way he was sort of handling himself? Do you think promoters were concerned about filling the arenas when he came back for Quarry? Or do you think they were?
Well, the big thing at that time, I mean, you got to remember when he came back with Quarry in Atlanta, it was a small arena. I don't know what did it hold, 3,000 people. But the closed circuit was coming in then. And that's where the money is. I mean, you could have a fight in a phone booth, and you have the closed circuit, what's going to make the money. The closed circuit is the big money, even today.
He did not come back as the speed clearly he was a different Ali, and I'm wondering, um, in his returning bouts, what you noticed about him, the difference between Ali, sort of Ali Liston, and Ali Jerry Quarry.
Well,
He's a very different guy.
that's a very interesting question. I remember asking him one time, who would win, Cassius Clay or Muhammad Ali? And I mean, that's some in-depth conversation I had with him. And he said, Cassius Clay was move around and hit, and he said, but Muhammad Ali was more smarter now. Would take his shots, hit, boom, hit, move away. Not all that moving crazy. Rope-a-dope, punch himself out. You know, that, he said, Muhammad Ali would beat Cassius Clay because he was smarter. Goes back to the same things, brain, speed, and guts.
It's kind of interesting to me, though, that, I mean, Muhammad Ali learned that he could take a punch. Cassius Clay never learned that he could take a punch because he never got
He
hit.
took some punches. He took the Doug Jones, and he took the Henry Cooper. And don't forget, he was sparring a lot. You know, he had a good jaw. But what made his jaw so great was his reflexes and his timing, where you couldn't get that solid shot at him. It wasn't that he could take a good punch. He had great reflexes.
I want to talk to you a little bit about Africa and Ali and Zaire. Africa to Ali. What's the connection there? Africa and Ali. How do you connect the two?
Let's go back to Muhammad Ali and I. We were down. He was doing the color for the Ken Norton George Foreman fight in Caracas, Venezuela, and they were already talking to Herbert about a fight in Zaire, Africa. Now, nobody heard of Zaire, Africa. Nobody heard of Korea. No one heard of Vietnam until there was a war. So nobody heard of Zaire, Africa. So Muhammad Ali, we're talking in the car, he said, I can make that place famous, which he did. Anytime people hear about Zaire, Africa, they remember Muhammad Ali. So we went down to the fight in Caracas, Venezuela, and Ali was doing the color, and George Foreman knocked out Ken Norton. So Ali held a press conference the next day, and he said, I'm going to go fight in the Congo, over in Zaire, and all you reporters who talk bad about me, when you get over there, they're going to put you in a pot and cook you. And everybody laughed. So we go back to the training camp, and we got a call from Washer Jimpupu, who was the top man to Mabuta. And he said, is Muhammad there? I said, hold on. He knew me from talking with me several times. He said, Muhammad, we're civilized. We're doing this to promote tourism. We don't put people in pots and cook them anymore. Okay, I'm sorry. So I remember that like it was yesterday. And the fight in Zaire, Africa, and you know how hard he trained. And then we got over there, the fight was postponed. But getting back a little bit, when we got there, it was late at night, and we got off the airplane. And you hear everybody yelling, Ali, Ali. And it was dark out. You couldn't see anybody or hear people. And he turned to me and he said, who don't they like here? I said, I guess white people. He said, well, how can I tell them George Foreman's white? You're here with me and Angelo. So I said, the Belgians. So we get off the airplane, they're yelling, Ali, Ali, and he puts his hands in the air. Shh. George Foreman's of Belgium. And they start yelling, Ali Boumaye, Ali Boumaye. So I turned to our interpreter and I said, Galinga, what is that? He said, that means Ali, kill him. Ali, kill him. He said, that means kill him in Swahili. So that's where that phrase came by. And then the Belgians used to put the dogs on the people in Africa. The Belgians controlled it. And here comes George Foreman off the airplane with a big German Shepherd dog. I said, we're home free.
The people really did embrace him. They truly
Yes,
loved him.
yes, they did. You know, would you believe it, 32 years ago, this same time we're counting down for the fight. 32 years ago. Time goes fast. And he had time for the people. They would come out and sing out, and we all had our own little villa in the grill. He would come out and they would sing there and entertain them, and he was kind to people. And there was an interesting thing happened that I observed. Bodini brought over a bunch of T-shirts, maybe about 100 T-shirts with all these pictures on. And the only T-shirt selling over there was Mabuda. So the government man came in and he told Bodini, I want to buy up all your T-shirts. And Bodini said, I'm selling them for $10. I said, no, tell him you're selling for 20. He said, I'm selling them for 20. And they bought them right there on the spot. Because they didn't want, I think in my heart, you know, Mabuda stood there in the stadium. I give this stadium to the people. The people, this is their stadium. And I think he was afraid that Ali might have said, I want the country. I'm going to be your president. Everybody would have followed him. I believe that in my heart today. Mabuda kind of stayed away from him, was a little leery. You know, he knew how much the people loved him, and he could have, I think to this day, he could have taken that country over. I believe that is from the bottom of my heart.
The fight in and of itself was immense. I mean, Foreman was a giant and dangerous. What was so important about this event in the ring? Why was this fight so important?
Well, you got to remember, 10 years prior, Muhammad Ali was the champion when he beat Liston. 10 years later, he's not the champion. George Foreman wouldn't even mention his name. You know, no one would, you know. So here he is coming back to Africa for the title. And it was a blessing because Ali had nothing to do but train. You know, when we got there, I made an appointment with the ambassador from America to Zaire. We got all the, we went to the commissary. We got all the food. Ali ate just like he did. I talked to MGM in New York City. They sent us movies over. We watched movies every night. All he could do was rest, and request for that fight. When he was in America, everybody had to hustle. They would come around, go here, go there, come there. And all he had to do was train. So I think it was a godsend that he fought in Zaire, Africa. No one could get to him. And he used to say, as he laid on the couch watching the movies, Gene, I'm blessed. I don't have to go anywhere. Just lay here, watch the movies, and train. Isn't this great? I have nobody bothering me, nobody calling me. You know, everybody called him for this and that.
If ever he had a time to be frightened before a fight, scared, you know, I can only imagine men have fear. Do you think Ali may have been in some ways frightened of Foreman?
No.
Or was he?
He never had any fear.
Say that again.
Muhammad Ali never had any fear. Let me tell you, backing it up to the George Foreman fight, they had a press conference in New York City. Not a press conference, a writer's boxing dinner. And when we went in, I was sitting there with Jack Dempsey. Muhammad Ali and I and Jack Dempsey was talking, and Ali was talking to Jack Dempsey. He said, you were such a powerful puncher, and I seen all your movies, and Mr. Dempsey, he called him Mr. Dempsey. And Jack was in awe of this man who was so nice and who he used to hear was so loud and all, and here he's sitting there quiet, talking nice. And in comes George Foreman, and he stopped, and he's staring at him. And Ali said, excuse me, Mr. Dempsey. And he went right up to George Foreman's face. He said, you're staring at me, I'll whip your butt right here. Who do you think? I'm scared of you. I ain't scared of you. Sonny Liston did that when he was a little boy. I'll whip your butt right here. And Foreman started looking down, and he said, do you hear me, boy? I'm talking to you. And Foreman looked down and walked away, and Ali came right back. Excuse me, Mr. Dempsey, I just won round one. And then we were on the dais, and Ali's talking. You know, he said, George Foreman don't hit hard. Joe Frazier was on the dais. He hits hard. Bonavina, he hits hard. But George Foreman don't hit hard. And he humiliated him and embarrassed him. Put the sign, do not disturb.
Yeah.
You put the sign on the door?
Yeah.
What?
3 days.
Yeah, late checkout though, later.
Venereal disease in here.
Tomorrow. Tomorrow.
Typhoid.
Filming right now. Thank you.
Did you get the venereal disease part?
Yeah. Okay, go ahead. So Ali gets up on the dais and he talks. George Foreman don't hit hard. Joe Frazier, he hits hard. They hit them. 1, 2, count them out. George Foreman never knocked anyone out. Never knocked any. He gets them on Queer Street. And he humiliated George, and George jumped up and he reached around and he grabbed his jacket in the back and ripped it. And when he did, Ali ripped his shirt off. Started screaming at him, and George left. And George went back to the back of the auditorium. And Ali said, I want to know where you're staying. I'm going to come by and beat your butt. I'm going to get you. And Ali was quiet and gentle as could be.
Where do you think that it...
I'll change tape.
Yeah, go ahead.
Good. Okay. All right, John.
Did you, not a whole lot of people believed that Ali was going to win this fight. Did you believe that he was going to win this fight?
You know, Norman Mailer wrote a story that everybody was scared in the dressing room. And I'm going to back it up a little bit. Before we left his Zaire, Africa, Ali said, come on, Gene, I want to use the phone. And we called Casamata, who Ali respected as one of the greatest trainers in boxing. And he got Cuss on the phone. He said, Cuss, how do I fight him? And he told Ali, he said, he's a bully. Your first punch must be with bad intentions. You must hit him hard. Ali said, yeah, you're right, you're right. Tell Gene. And I got on the phone. And I said, Cuss, look what Foreman did to Norton. Look what he did to Frazier. And Cuss yelled. He was in New York. We were in Deer Lake, Pennsylvania. I could have heard him without the phone. But they're not Ali. He said, he's a bully. He must take his heart right away. So then in Zaire, Africa, I went into the dressing room, and they were taping George. They were putting the tape in his hands and putting the gloves on. I had to witness it. And Dick Sadler was walking around. I smelled murder in the air. I smell murder. And I look, and I go back to Ali's dressing room. He said, what's he talking about over there? I said, he's talking about putting your kids in an orphanage. And I said, ooh, I can't wait to get him. Ooh, I can't wait to get him. Oh, I'm going to, ooh, I got something for him. So if you watch the fight closely, you'll see George come out like this. And Ali's first punch came up and he hit him. Boom. And then George went. And years later, I asked George about that fight. And he said, when he hit me the first time, I thought, although all the lights went out. And then he abused me. No one ever abused me. He was the bully. And if you look at back in life, the bully, when you whip the bully's butt, he wants to be your friend. Everyone in life, they remember the bully that offended him, but the bully doesn't remember anyone he offended. So he was the bully. Liston was the bully. Ali beat him. Then Leotis Martin came back and beat Liston. It showed he wasn't invincible. Ali beat George Foreman, the bully. And then Jimmy Young came back and beat him, the bully. And that's what Ali did. He loved the bully.
This notion of rope-a-dope, you know, the smart fighter. You know, it takes a great deal of courage to stand in there and say to yourself, okay, I'm going to work this guy 5 rounds, 6 rounds,
But
7 rounds, and then I'm going to get my chance.
You want to know something? We watched, I used to get Ali, the video fights of the people he was fighting. And we watched one time, he was fighting Joe Frazier in New York at the Coliseum or something there. And he hit Joe Frazier, and Joe Frazier went down. And then he went to the neutral corner. And Ali said, run it back. I said, run it back to where he hit him. No, no. And he hit him and went down, and George Foreman went back on the ropes to get to the neutral corner. Ali said, run it back again. And we watched him on the ropes. He said, no stamina. He don't know what it's like. Round 5, round 6, round 7, he's out of gas. Round 8, I got him. No stamina. Plus, he frustrated him. He abused him. He called him everything in that ring. Is that the best you have, George? Is that the best shot? You're nothing.
Where did that voice come from?
Ali's voice? The voice came from his dad. Ha-ma-ma-ma, ha-ma-ma. That was his dad. His mom, oh, thank you, Gene. That was him. So he was a double personality.
The story that you told in your piece for the BBC about the tickets, I think that's a wonderful piece of history about how Ali brought in the other people. Can you frame that story for me?
Yeah, when it was like about 20 minutes before we had to go out into the arena, And I came back and I told him all them poor people are out there, can't get in the fight. He said, go get Mabuda. I said, okay. So I went out. He was sitting there proud at the ringside. I said, Ali wants to see him. What does he want to see me about? I said, you better go back and see him. Well, what is it? I said, he'll tell you. So we go back and he said, all them poor people out there, they can't come to the fight. You couldn't sell another ticket. All them empty seats. I'm not fighting them unless you let them in. He said, we can't let them in. They have no tickets, and that's the program. I'm not fighting. Take the gloves off. So wait a minute. He went back. He said, go with him, Gene. I went. I said, they just let everybody in. Ali said, good. I want another fight.
Is that just the kind of guy he
Yeah.
was?
He always had time for the poor, the powerless, the depressed, the deprived. Muhammad Ali. He had a good heart.
In some ways, he was fighting for the people at that point in Zaire, yes?
He was fighting for the little. He always fought for the little people. He was always, I remember the time that there was a great writer. There were three great writers. Eddie Schuyler, Jerry Eisenberg, and Bud Schulberg came up to interview him at the training camp. And here's a little kid in 8th grade was doing a project for his 8th grade class. And he came in, he introduced himself, and Ali spent just as much time with him as he did the other writers. There was something about him. We're blessed. Leroy Neiman said anyone who touched his robe was a better person. And that's the way it was. Everybody learned from. Everyone you met in life, no matter where I go, they say, I met Ali. I remember this, I remember that. You ask people, where were you when John Kennedy was assassinated? They all have an answer. Where were you when Muhammad Ali won the heavyweight title from George Foreman?
I just want to hit a couple of things, but take you back a little bit to the Garden and Frazier Ali won. Just get a couple of things. Good.
Clear.
That fight, the first fight with Frazier, sort of everyone I talked to, it seemed like the first thing they say is the world stopped. That they were polarized. It was politics. It was polar camps. It was this and that. And the fight was more than a fight. It was, there was a lot going on there.
As you mentioned that fight, I'm going to tell you some behind-the-scenes things that happened that people aren't even aware of.
Please.
2 weeks prior, Ali came in for a press conference in New York City. And at that time, I was working with MGM. And I went to the press conference with him, and they had him scheduled for the Johnny Carson show that night. John Condon, Madison Square Garden, who was one of the best PR and publicists in the industry. And he said, you're going to do the Johnny Carson show tonight. And it started to snow. I say, Ali, they flew him in. He came in overnight, and then he was supposed to leave the next night, do the Carson show. I say, Ali, this was like about 12 noon. I said, it's starting to snow here pretty bad. He said, what do you think? I said, you better go back to Miami. He said, you're right. Everybody was saying, no, you should stay, do that. No, Gene's right. So Ali flew back to Miami. He went out to the airport at 5 o'clock, and they just about got out. There was such a big snowstorm where he could train in Miami. And Johnny Carson came on the show that night. I remember it was a Friday night. And he said, Muhammad Ali was supposed to be here. He wasn't here. He'll never do my show again. Now, Freddie DeCarver, the producer of the Johnny Carson show would call me. Would like to get him on. And I said, well, no. And Ali said, no, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. So they called. So finally he agreed to go on after that. Bud Schulberg wrote the book, Loser and Still Heavyweight Champion. And Ali did the show, and he walked out, and they played the fight songs and all. And Ali said, Johnny, you were mad at me. Oh, no, champ, I wasn't mad at you. You said I'll never be on your show again. Oh, no, I must have been drunk that day, But he made Johnny come down to his level. He had a certain way about him. And talking about the Frazier fight, he stayed in the Garden that day. His brother was fighting on the undercard. And I think he should have been able to go and rest in his home and all, not stay in a different environment and everything. It might have been a different fight. But I had the fight a lot closer than they had it. You know me, I have him winning every round anyway. You know, I'm so prejudiced towards him. But 30 days after the fight, he had a bus, a big mobile bus, and we drove it back to Cherry Hill, New Jersey. His jaw was swollen. And 30 days later, he was in New York visiting me, and we got a call from Bud Schulberg. And he said, I heard that Joe Frazier died. I said, what? I said, Muhammad. Bud said he heard Joe Frazier died. Joe Frazier was in St. Luke's Hospital, and I called his doctor, Dr. Gaffrey, who I knew very well. And he said, Joe, it was touch and go for him, but he's okay. But Ali said in that interim, if Joe Frazier dies, I'll never fight again. I will never fight again. But he pulled through. You know, people always said about the bad and the hard feelings between Joe Frazier and Ali. And I used to tell them, you know, someday I want to sit down in the park with you and Joe, and we'll just reminisce old times. And Joe's kind of put that behind him. You know, he didn't like Ali calling him the gorilla. And Joe was right. He said his kids had to go to school, your daddy's the gorilla. But Ali meant no harm by it. He was just selling tickets for the fight.
That first fight, was that first fight white against black? Was it more than just two men in a ring? Did it have a whole lot of other meanings?
Well,
or?
Joe Frazier was Madison Square Garden. And it was the rebellious. See, anyone who rebelled in anything, they were rooting for Ali. If you rebelled, you don't want to go to school. They were rooting for Ali. If you rebelled, you didn't want to wear this or wear that. It was the rebellious against the people said, okay. So that's the way that fight was.
Got it. You're a man with a great knowledge of history, and I'm wondering if you know, if a Muhammad Ali could exist today, or whether or not we have to consider his greatness in the context of history, in the context of time and place. Could an Ali happen today, or is Ali a part of a fabric of that time?
I don't believe the original, you know, you can Xerox, but it's not the real thing. You know, there's one in every life. There's one person. There's one Mahatma Gandhi. There's one Honorable Elijah Muhammad. There's one John Kennedy. There's one Robert Kennedy. There's one Ali. You know, you could never go back and duplicate it or pretend it. It just doesn't happen. You know, Ali, by his mother's training to care for people, by his dad's about giving him direction to work hard and don't cheat anybody, by his religious belief with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, by his guidance by Herbert Muhammad, by his association. I used to tell him one time, we had all types of people around our training camp. There was the apostles and disciples. The apostles were the close ones. Disciples were outer circle. But he brought us all together. Some were Muslims, some were Catholics, some were Protestants, Jewish people. He brought us all together. And it was him, it was nobody else.
The Pope asked for his autograph. Brezhnev was heard saying, "Who is this Ali?" And but the room attendant in Caesar's was, you know, considered him his best friend because he was kind to him. I'm wondering how it is that he transcended so many walks of life.
Because he touched so many people. Today, on the way up on the elevator, there's a door. One of the bellmen said that I remember when Ali lived downtown for a year and a half. It never happened. But people started to believe this. You know, the real Ali, everybody sees, only a few knew. And I was blessed to be one of the few who knew him. I was pallbearer for his mom, his dad, how he reached out to people, how he would visit hospitals, see a little boy dying, and the little boy would tell him, you know, he told you, I'm going to beat George Foreman and you're going to beat cancer. No, Muhammad. I'm going to meet God and I'm going to tell him that I know you. You know what that is? Here's a little boy dying, 12 years old, didn't know about heaven or hell or anything, but he's going to, you know, drop a name. I'm going to go to heaven. I'm going to say, I know Muhammad Ali. And what a compliment that is. Now, you look back, you see Babe Ruth, he went to the hospitals, signed balls. You had all the camera crew there. Anytime Ali went, we used to go to Shriners Hospital in Philadelphia. We went to the Burn Hospital in Memphis with no cameras. I mean, he's done so much for people. And he said, if you're going to do it, you don't do it for the publicity, you do it from your heart.
You were very close to him, and I'm wondering what it was like for you to watch him in his later years start taking
Sure,
those
it's sad.
beatings.
Well, he didn't take many beatings in the ring. You know, the sparring was the thing that got him.
But at some point, you must have believed he should have stopped fighting.
I wanted him to stop fighting right after Zaire, Africa. Now retire. You know, people remember, they always remember an athlete, his last shot. They remember Willie Mays running into second base falling. They remember Joe Louis on the canvas with Marciano. You know, the only one who really left the sport when he was on top of his game, any sports, was Jim Brown. So the people remember Muhammad Ali, you know, they remember the bad things about him getting up off. They always show the fight, him getting up off the canvas with Joe Frazier. You know, but I wanted him to retire. But then he told me, people, I'm getting offered $8 million. $8 million to fight Larry Holmes. He said people would get out of a wheelchair for $8 million. So I told Mike Tyson, I said, fighters beat everything but Father Time. They beat everything with Father Time.
It was the money that kept him in the ring?
$8 million. You, your audience listening to this fight, you know, who are crippled and lame, and just go to any, knock on any door, would you fight this guy for $8 million? Whew.
Right.
That's a big temptation, isn't it?
He's not in great shape now. He's obviously quite sick, and I'm wondering if he had a voice today, if he could stand up and speak out and you know, and have that energy, what might the Muhammad Ali be saying today about war or boxing or those sorts of things? What would he be, if you could give him a voice? What might he
Well,
speak
I
about?
could never speak for Muhammad Ali, nor would I try. He is his own person, you know, but I'm sure he's seeing the way the country is today and how the kids are today. You got to remember, Muhammad would always dress nice, not the Superfly guy, the nice suit, the tie. You know, you don't see that today. You know, Muhammad was welcome everywhere, in everybody's home and everyone's country, you know. But it's a different era today. It's a different lifestyle. Everything changes, you know. So I can't speak for Muhammad. I know that he's probably disappointed in boxing, but everything will change. You know, that this too will come to pass, you know, from his religious belief about things. But I can't speak for him.
Let me ask it from a different direction. Why aren't the Tiger Woods of today, the LeBron James, the top black, they must have feelings about race, about what's going on in today's world. Why aren't they speaking out? Why aren't they standing on the bully pulpit saying stop, saying no, saying this is wrong?
I'm going to tell you a situation. When Muhammad retired from boxing, maybe 10 years later, I watched Eddie Murphy do Saturday Night Live. And he came in a boxing robe, and he said, I'm the greatest of all time. I'm 3-time champion. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. And everybody laughed. And I watched it at home with tears in my eyes. And I knew my day would come where I could confront him. About a year and a half later, I ran into Eddie Murphy. And I told him, I said, Eddie, why would you put down Muhammad Ali? He's done so much for the black people. And you put him down. He said, my directors and producers told me I had to do it. I said, his directors and producers would never tell him what he had to do. So he was his own person, you know, and that was Muhammad Ali. He did his own thing. He was his own person.
He had the courage to stand up.
Dignity. You know, like the song, you can't take away my dignity, the greatest song, the greatest love of all. And that's what it was about. Michael Massa wrote it, the greatest love of all. You can't take away my dignity, and that's what it is.
If there are lessons that we should take with us about him, about his life, from his life, what are those
Well,
great lessons?
There's an old Chinese proverb, and it said, "You're never dead as long as you're remembered." And Muhammad Ali will always be remembered. You know, he's going to be remembered by going to Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Israel, all over the world. And he'll be remembered by the little people and the big people. And that is his legacy. There wasn't a bad bone in his body. All of us are born, there's original sin. It's called jealousy. He has no jealousy. He had no jealousy about anybody. When Spinks beat him, he said, "He beat me, he's the greatest." You know, and he came back and won back the title. He's never said, "No, I got robbed, I did this." He never alibied. To be a great champion, you can't alibi, and that was Ali.
What did he teach you about life?
He taught me about life that everybody counts. Everybody has problems. You meet a guy coming down the street, you never know his problems. Here's a man walking towards you, looks a little worried. He may have a little boy who's dying in a hospital. Have time for people, care for people. But on the other hand, you can't put your arm around the whole world. You know, don't let people con you. Be good to people. Be around people you want to be around. Enjoy your friends. Our clock is ticking down. You know, we lost so many friends of our own group. So many people has died. And you know, I told him one time, "What do you have to look forward to?" He said, "Maybe someday in heaven we'll all be together. Joe Louis, myself, Louis Soria, sitting there talking about the old days, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad." That's what we have to look forward to. What would you like on this earth, Dolly? "Oh, I'd like to have a big farm and all my children there, just hanging out with me, talking. My mom, my dad, my brother."
If he had a fault, if there was a character, could he be construed as being loyal to a fault?
His generosity.
Was he too generous?
One time I told him, we're kidding around at the training camp, and I said, "Ali, there was a fellow here just taking up a collection for an unknown soldier's mother." He said, "We got to give." I said, "The unknown soldier's mother, we don't even know who she is." And we all laughed. And then he said, "Ooh, I'm going to get you." But he was you know, I was blessed to be around him. You know, my life was so good with him. If I was to die tomorrow, I would be taking a step down, because my heaven was being around him. I remember when my mother was in a hospital here in Vegas. She was in bad shape. He was in Vegas, and he asked me, "How's your mother?" I said, "She's in the hospital." He said, "We're going to go see her." And we went to the hospital, myself, Herbert, Muhammad, Lloyd Wells. We went to see her. And all of a sudden, she became from just an individual going into that hospital. They treated her like the queen. Everybody came to see her. Little people, big people, doctors. Muhammad Ali was in here. What's he like? Isn't he nice? Oh yeah. So he knew how to elevate people. He knew how to take a little guy and make him a big shot.
I have one last question. There's been a lot of revisionist history now. Now it's sort of fashion to write about Ali, and it's not all good. It's not. It's you know. The revisionist history sort of material is it's not all pretty. But what I'm wondering, you're such you love the man, and you're such a good friend of his, and you do know, you're one of those people that truly knows him. I'm wondering what it is that you know about him that we don't, that you think we should. What is it that goes unknown about this man? What is it that you think we should know about him that we don't?
Well, there's nothing bad about him. If you look through my eyes to see Muhammad, you'll see only good and kindness. But you got to remember what sells books. People write negative stuff. The people are dead, they can't defend themselves. You know, there's good and bad in all of us. You know, one time Muhammad told me if a little baby was in a room and a crook came in with a gun to rob the room, the little baby knew no danger and knew nothing wrong. He'd wave, goo goo, he'd wave at the crook. You know, so people, you judge people the way they treat you. I can only judge Muhammad the way he treated me and my family and my friends. You know, what can they write about him? You know, what can they say about him? People write books, it was never even around them, they're writing books. People do interviews, they never even covered his fight. They're talking like they're experts on him. You know, I've been there and I've been blessed to be there. And to this day, we'll always be friends. You know, people may try to lock me out of his life, but they can't lock me out of his heart or me out of his heart, you know. They can't lock me out of his heart or no one can lock him out of my heart.
What is it that we've lost when he's gone, Gene? What's does he live on forever? Or?
Well, like I stated earlier, the Chinese proverb, you're never dead as long as you're remembered. People will always be remembered, Muhammad Ali. But not as a great fighter, not as a great humanitarian, but as a kind, considerate, loved his parents. Bill Russell once said, if I had a son, I would like him to be like Muhammad Ali. Karl Malone, the greatest forward that ever played the game. You know, he said, I have one wish. I wish my son could meet Muhammad Ali. Karl met him. He was in awe.
Okay, my friend. That's what I have for me. I think you should stand up. Stand
Okay.
up and stretch maybe.
I'm okay.
Because you're so. Is everybody out of his eye line?
Okay.
You can come across.
You wanna come
I want you to stay out of his eye line so he doesn't peek
You
at you.
wanna-
Yeah, I won't pick
So,
him.
Excellent. So Gene, let's set up the thriller in Manila for us. What was at stake in this fight? It was obviously the heavyweight rubber match, but set it up for us.
Well, coming back to the third Frazier fight, I've been asked many times which was Ali's greatest fight, and I said this #2 Frazier fight, where the next day we walked from the Garden, no bruises, no bangs, down to the press conference at Madison Square Garden. I thought that was a great fight for Ali. But viewing the heavyweight fight between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier in Zaire, viewing the fight in Manila between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, that was the toughest fight. It was the roughest heavyweight fight I've ever seen in my life. How they pounded each other and bang, bang. I remember in the fourth round, Ali hit Frazier and his mouthpiece went out and went back into the stands. And someone came running by and to our corner and said, here's Frazier's mouthpiece. And Bodini said, throw it underneath the mat. And Ali heard him. He said, give it back to Frazier. I'm going to beat him fair and square. He did. And then they fought so hard. Ali came back to in the 14th round, and he was so tired. And he said, wow, this is murder. And I looked up, and Eddie Futch stopped the fight. I say, Ali, the fight's over. And Ali said, all praises due to Allah. You know, I don't know if he could have went on another round. But everybody said Ali fainted after the fight. Ali didn't faint after. He sat down. Everybody was jumping around him, going crazy. So he just sat down. But it was a tough fight for him. And it was a tough fight for Joe Frazier. I mean, it was just stand there, bang, bang, bang. And I have a lot of respect for Eddie Futch. I thought he was one of the most knowledgeable trainers and the most caring trainers in professional sports.
Was the Frazier Ali was that sort of the greatest rivalry, and were they well matched opponents?
They were a well-matched opponent. Both of them wanted it so bad. And it was the epitome of the heavyweight champions. They talk about their Dempsey, Tunney, you know, Jack Johnson and Marciano, but there was nothing like the Thriller in Manila. And Ali called it the Thriller in Manila. He named it. It's going to be a thriller in Manila when I get the gorilla. And which I didn't like to see him call Joe the Gorilla, but it sold tickets.
Describe the arena. The fight was hot. What were the conditions in that time?
Ring temperature at ringside was about 120 degrees. It was in George Arnetta. He owned the arena, and there was no air conditioning or nothing, and it was so hot there, and the ring was so small. And Ali was a true champion. He trained so hard for the fight. We got over there early. He rested, he trained, but he always prepared himself. He told me, you must train different for a George Foreman and a Joe Frazier than you would train for a Jimmy Ellis or Jerry Quarry.
The Ali dominates the early rounds, and Frazier sort of comes back within the middle of the fight. Then Ali starts to come back. Take me through your emotions of the fight, and how did Ali turn the tide?
Ali was moving and hitting in the early rounds, and then he found out he could jab him, and then a right hand, which he caught Frazier with a lot of right hands. And Frazier's not a fighter who would back up. I always told Ali, when you fight Joe Frazier, you know where he's going to be right on the end of your gloves. He always said, yeah, you're right about that. And that's the way it was. I mean, Frazier couldn't even see after the 14th round. He couldn't see anybody. He was fighting on instinct, the 14th round and the 13th round.
Did Ali tire in the middle of that fight?
No. People said he tired. He didn't tire. He was in great physical conditioning. He ran every day. He exercised with Luis Soria. Everything was fine. He came into the ring hitting on all cylinders. I used to tell him one time, I said, when you train great for a fight, you did your best. It's like taking a trip cross country with all kind of credit cards in your pocket, all type of money and a brand new car. Now, when you don't train, it's like taking a trip across country with just a little bit of money, a beat-up old car. You may make it, but it's not the same. And he always referred to that, going into the ring, he said, well, we did everything right. We're going cross country with a brand new car, a lot of credit cards, and a lot of money in our pocket, and he'd laugh.
This fight, I mean, truly, it was a true slugfest. As a good friend, you must have. I mean, that was a war in that ring.
I sat in the corner and I watched that fight and seen them bang, 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 and I said to myself, they should abolish boxing. Should
Really?
anyone take this punishment?
By the 10th round, both fighters are showing fatigue. The pace is slowing. Neither looks near ready to give up. What did this fight sort of show about both of them and their determination?
Joe Frazier had a heart as big as his body. Muhammad Ali, if he weighed 220 for the pound for the fight, his heart was 218. Muhammad always wanted it, his pride. He said, if I lose, little people cry. If Joe Frazier loses, just another fight. He thought he was representing the whole world. He believed in himself. He dedicated himself. He had such great pride.
Let's talk about that 13th
Hold
round.
for 1 second.
Yep. It's great stuff, Chief.
You shooting digital?
Okay.
I just ordered the Nikon 200.
Nice. There? Yep.
Let's talk about that 13th round and what you remember about it. Ali does knock out Frazier's mouthpiece, and Frazier's legs buckle at one point. Describe what you remember about that 13th.
Well, I thought the mouthpiece went out in the earlier rounds.
Yeah.
In the 13th round, when the mouthpiece went out, a fella brought it back to the corner. He said, here's Frazier's mouthpiece, and he said, throw it underneath the ring. Ali said, no, I'm going to beat him fair and square, send it back to him, so they took it over. We always had, in our corner, we always kept extra mouthpieces for the fight in case anything broke or anything. But, Ali didn't want to take any shortcuts. If he was going to beat a guy, he'll beat him fair and square.
In the 13th, did it look like Ali sort of regained control of the fight and was on his way to winning?
I said something about Ali, no matter what fight he was in, he could always reach down in his trick bag and pull something out and go on. From the Ernie Schaefer's fight, from the Frazier fights, from the Foreman fights, the Jerry Quarry fights, the Sonny Liston fight, he had a way of reaching down and picking something up out of his trick bag to go on and be victorious. But he said that was because of his religion. Allah wasn't going to see him fail.
Why do you think Eddie Futch stopped the fight?
Because Frazier couldn't see, and Frazier didn't want to stop the fight. Eddie was a dedicated trainer, the most dedicated trainers. Ali was training Riddick Bowe, and Riddick Bowe wouldn't listen to him, so Eddie Futch walked away. He could have stayed there and got a paycheck. That's not what Eddie Futch was about.
His man didn't have it in him.
Whose man?
Frazier. Did Frazier, I mean, you know, I'm just,
Yeah, go ahead.
Frazier didn't have it in him to come back out. I mean, Eddie pulled,
Frazier wanted to come out. Eddie said, I'm stopping the fight. Frazier said, no, no, no. He said, I'm stopping it, that's it. I stopped the fight.
Ali was later quoted saying that he was ready to quit if Joe had not stopped.
I never heard that one. People said all kind of things, but Ali would go on and on and on. He wasn't a quitter. That wasn't in his vocabulary. There was no such a word as can't. I can't. He never had that in his vocabulary, and he encouraged many people in business and the world, and never used the word can't.
Do you recall? Apparently, he told Angelo that he was this was the closest to dying he had ever been.
He didn't tell Angelo that. He told the press after the fight. He said, "This was hell. This is the closest I've been to death. If this is death, I've been there."
He did not faint at the end of the
No,
round?
he sat down. All you crazy people jump around. I'm sitting down. He didn't faint. He didn't fall down. He just sat down and let people jump around.
What did winning that fight mean to Muhammad Ali? What was his mood after the fight?
He told me when he fought in Zaire, Africa, this is going to be a long ride if we lose this fight. I can't lose it back to America, the same way in Manila. I can't lose this fight. It's too far, a long ride back. You know, his pride carried him through in all his fights. He was a dedicated gladiator.
What do you think winning that third fight meant to him?
It meant everything to him. He cleaned his chart. He beat Frazier now twice. Frazier won one.
Why do you think this fight was significant? How does it sort of within the career of Ali? How does it define him as a boxer? How does it define him as a man? Where does it sit within his career?
It defines him as a man by having the pride to go on and do things. As a boxer, it showed he was a gladiator. As a student of the game, he was smart enough to do the right things.
And where does it sit? Sorry.
Go ahead.
Where does it sit within the wins, within the great fights of his career? Where does it sit?
It was a great fight, but I always said the second Frazier fight was a better fight for Ali because he wasn't banged up. This was a great fight. He came, you know, Casamata said to be a great fighter, you gotta come from within. You gotta want it, and this is what Ali showed him in that fight.